If you're hearing this, then somehow, you found me, and that means I'm no longer hidden. The wind didn't just howl that night. It pressed against the cabin like something alive, something searching, slipping through the cracks in the wood with a low, restless breath that made the lantern flame tremble on the table. Alara Whitmore stood very still in the center of the one-room cabin, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of a worn wooden chair, listening. Out here, nearly 30 miles from the nearest pack boundary, there shouldn't have been anything but forest and silence. That was the point. She had chosen this place because it was forgotten, because no one came this far into the northern ridge unless they had a reason, and no one had a reason to look for a girl who had already disappeared from the world. The cabin itself leaned slightly to one side, its structure weathered by years of snowstorms and neglect, the roof patched with uneven boards she had hammered into place herself. It smelled faintly of pine sap and smoke, the kind of scent that clung to fabric and skin, masking everything else. Especially her. Especially what she wasn't. Alara moved quietly toward the narrow window, careful not to let the floorboards creak under her weight, and brushed 2 fingers across the frost gathering along the glass. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, dark tree trunks rising like pillars beneath a sky heavy with clouds, the snow reflecting just enough pale light to outline the world in shades of silver and gray. No movement, no sound except the wind. Still, something felt off. She had learned to trust that feeling. It was the same instinct that had told her to run the night everything changed, the night the pack elders stood in a circle and spoke about bonds as if they were chains meant to be fastened without question. An Omega doesn't choose, they had said, their voices calm, certain. She is chosen. The memory flickered behind her eyes, hands reaching, voices closing in, the weight of expectation pressing down until breathing itself felt like defiance. And then the moment she stepped back instead of forward, the moment silence fell, the moment she turned and ran. Alara exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the glass before fading into nothing. That had been weeks ago, maybe longer. Time blurred out here, measured only by the number of times she had to gather firewood or melt snow for water. She had learned how to move without leaving tracks, how to keep her scent buried beneath smoke and cold air, how to make herself smaller than the world expected her to be. It was working. It had to be. No one had come. No one had found her. Until tonight. The feeling pressed harder now, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had shifted in a way she couldn't explain. Alara stepped back from the window, her heartbeat picking up, not loud, but steady and alert. She reached for the lantern, turning the flame down just enough to dim the room, shadows stretching along the walls as the light softened. Instinct. Always instinct. She had survived this long by listening to it. The wind quieted for a brief, unnatural moment. And in that silence, there it was. Not a crash, not a shout, just a presence. Close. Too close. Alara's fingers tightened around the lantern handle, her pulse now a steady rhythm in her ears as she turned her head slightly toward the door. The old wood stood firm, reinforced from the inside with a simple bar she had carved herself, a fragile barrier between her and everything she had left behind. No one knew she was here. No one should have known. And yet, a sound broke through the stillness. Not loud, not forceful, just 3 measured knocks against the door. Calm, certain, as if whoever stood on the other side wasn't asking to be let in, but already knew they would be. Alara did not move at first because movement meant decision, and decision meant risk, and she had survived this long by delaying both until she understood exactly what she was facing. The 3 knocks still echoed in her mind, steady and controlled, not the desperate pounding of someone lost in the forest, not the careless force of a hunter who believed the world belonged to him, but something else entirely, something that carried intention without urgency, like the person on the other side had all the time in the world. Her grip tightened around the lantern as she forced herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale, each exhale, grounding herself in the rhythm she had practiced every night since she arrived here. No one knew she was here. She repeated that silently, like a shield, like a truth she could cling to even as doubt pressed in from every side. She had covered her tracks, masked her scent, avoided every trail that might lead someone close. She had become invisible. That was the only way to survive. Another silence stretched, thicker this time, and she realized something that made her chest tighten in a way she did not like. Whoever stood outside was not leaving. They were waiting. Alara's eyes shifted toward the door, tracing the outline of the wood, the simple latch she had reinforced, the faint draft that slipped through the edges. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, the air heavier, as if the space itself was aware of the presence just beyond it. Her instincts stirred again, sharper now, not panic but awareness, like standing on the edge of something vast and unseen. She took one careful step forward, then another, her boots barely making a sound against the worn floorboards. The lantern light flickered with each movement, shadows shifting across the walls in slow, uneven patterns. She stopped a few feet from the door, close enough to hear more than just the wind. And that was when she noticed it. There was no shuffling of feet, no rustle of fabric, no breath visible beneath the cold night air seeping through the cracks. Just stillness. Absolute stillness. It was wrong. Even the most disciplined wolves made some kind of sound, some small indication of life. But this felt controlled in a way that unsettled her. Alara swallowed, her throat dry, and for a moment she considered ignoring it, letting whoever it was stand out there until they gave up and left. That was what she should do. That was the safest choice. But something in her resisted the idea, a quiet pull that did not feel like fear or curiosity, but something deeper, something that did not belong to logic at all. It felt like recognition without memory. Her fingers loosened slightly around the lantern handle as she leaned closer, just enough to bring her voice to the door without raising it. "There is nothing here for you," she said, her tone steady, controlled, though her pulse continued to beat faster beneath her ribs. The words sounded small the moment they left her mouth, swallowed by the wood between them. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, on the other side, a voice answered. Low, calm, unshaken by the cold or the distance or her attempt to push him away. "That is where you are wrong." The sound of it did not carry force, did not need to. It settled into the space around her, into the air she breathed, into the silence that followed. Alara's breath caught before she could stop it, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, a subtle shift in awareness that made every instinct she had sharpen and focus on the presence beyond the door. She had heard many voices in her life, some harsh, some kind, some filled with authority or expectation. But this one did not ask for attention. It commanded it simply by existing. Her heart thudded once, hard enough to make her grip tighten again. No, she could not let that matter. She could not let anything about this matter. "You should leave," she said, firmer this time, though she did not step back. "You have the wrong place." Another pause, but shorter now, as if the man outside was considering her words and finding them unnecessary. When he spoke again, there was something almost quiet in it, something that did not match the tension building in her chest. "Alara Whitmore," he said, her name falling into the space between them with unsettling precision. "Open the door." Everything inside her stilled. Not fear. Not yet. But something close to it, something colder, something sharper. Because there was only one thing more dangerous than being found. And that was being known. The world seemed to narrow to the space between her and the door, every other thought pushed aside by the weight of her name still lingering in the air, spoken as if it belonged to him, as if it had always belonged to him. And Alara felt something shift deep in her chest, not recognition exactly, but something that brushed too close to it. To be ignored, something that made her instincts sharpen instead of retreat, because this was not how hunters behaved. This was not how anyone from the pack would approach her, and yet the danger in it was undeniable, quiet and absolute, like standing at the edge of a frozen lake that looked solid until you realized how thin the ice truly was, and still she did not move, not forward, not back, suspended in that fragile moment where choice had not yet been made. Her fingers loosened slightly from the lantern handle, though the light continued to flicker between them, casting faint gold across the wood of the door, and she found herself staring at it as if she could see through it, as if she could understand what stood on the other side simply by willing it hard enough. But there was nothing, no shadow, no outline, only the sense of presence that refused to fade, steady and patient, waiting for her response. He knew her name. The thought echoed again, heavier now, layered with everything it implied. because she had not spoken it in weeks, had not allowed it to exist outside of her own mind, had buried it the same way she buried every trace of who she used to be. And yet he had said it with certainty, without hesitation, as if there had never been a question at all. Her pulse quickened, not out of panic, but out of awareness, a tightening focus that pulled every sense toward the door, toward the man who should not be here and yet was, as immovable as the storm itself. "You should not know that name," she said finally, her voice quieter now, more controlled, though it carried a thread of something sharper beneath it, not fear, but defiance, the same defiance that had driven her to run in the first place, the same refusal to accept what others decided for her. Silence followed her words, but it was not empty. It was filled with him, with the weight of his presence pressing gently but firmly against the fragile barrier between them, and for a moment she wondered if he would simply remain there, unmoved by her resistance, waiting her out until she had no choice left but to open the door. Then, slowly, he answered, "And yet I do." There was no arrogance in it, no threat, only certainty, the kind that did not need to be proven because it already existed beyond doubt, and that unsettled her more than anything else could have, because certainty like that did not come from guessing, it came from knowing, from understanding something she had spent her entire life trying to hide. Alara took a small step back, barely a shift in position, but enough to give her space to think, to breathe, to separate instinct from fear, because she could not afford to react blindly, not now, not when everything about this moment felt like a turning point she had not chosen but could not avoid. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one less reassuring than the last, until it settled on the only truth that mattered. If he knew her name, then he had been looking for her, not by chance, not by accident, deliberately. The realization settled into her bones with a quiet, chilling clarity, and with it came another question, one she could not ignore no matter how much she wanted to. Why? Her gaze flickered once more to the door, to the simple wood that separated her from answers she was not sure she wanted, and yet her body had already begun to move, drawn forward by something she could not fully understand, something that felt less like curiosity and more like inevitability, like the slow pull of a current beneath still water. She stopped just inches from the door, close enough now to feel the faint cold seeping through it, close enough that if she listened carefully, she could almost imagine she heard the quiet rhythm of his breathing on the other side, steady and unhurried. "If I open this door," she said softly, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind outside, "you leave if I tell you to." It was not a demand. It was not even a true condition. It was the last piece of control she could offer herself before everything changed. For a moment, there was no answer, and in that silence, her heart beat once, twice, each second stretching longer than the last, until finally, he spoke again, just as calm, just as certain as before. "Open the door, Alara." Not a promise, not a refusal, something else entirely. And somehow, that was the answer she had expected all along. Her hand hovered inches from the wooden bar that kept the door sealed, and for a moment, Alara simply stood there, feeling the weight of everything she had built pressing against that single fragile point of choice. Because opening the door was not just about letting someone inside. It was about breaking the illusion she had carefully constructed over weeks of silence and survival. The illusion that she could exist outside the reach of the world she had left behind. The lantern flame trembled slightly as her grip shifted, the warm light casting unsteady shadows across her fingers, and she became suddenly aware of how quiet the cabin had become, how the wind itself seemed to have stilled in anticipation, as if even the storm was waiting to see what she would do. She swallowed, her throat tight, and forced herself to focus, to think clearly, because instinct alone was not enough now, not when everything about this felt larger than fear, larger than danger, something deeper and far more difficult to name. He had not threatened her. He had not tried to force his way in. He had simply stood there, certain she would open the door. That certainty unsettled her more than anything else could have. Slowly, deliberately, Alara reached out and lifted the wooden bar from its place, the soft scrape of it against the brackets sounding louder than it should in the stillness. And for a brief second, she considered putting it back, pretending this moment had never happened, retreating into the fragile safety she had known before tonight. But she did not. Her hand moved to the handle instead, fingers curling around the worn metal, cold against her skin, and she drew in a steady breath before pulling the door open just enough to see. The night air slipped inside immediately, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of snow and pine and something else, something she had never felt before, something that did not belong to the forest or the storm, something that made her breath catch without warning. He stood there, exactly where she had imagined, and yet entirely different from anything she had expected, tall and still, his presence filling the narrow space between the cabin and the trees behind him, as if the world itself adjusted around him rather than the other way around. He did not step forward when the door opened. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his gaze steady and unhurried. And in that single look, Elara felt something inside her shift in a way she could not control, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, a quiet, instinctive awareness that made every sense sharpen at once. His eyes were the first thing she noticed, not because of their color, though they held a strange, pale intensity that caught the dim light, but because of the way they held her attention without effort, as if looking away would require more strength than she currently possessed. There was no hostility in them, no impatience, but there was something else, something deeper, something that felt like recognition in a way that made her pulse stutter once, hard and unexpected. Elara tightened her grip on the door, grounding herself, reminding herself that this was still her space, her choice, her control, even if it felt like that control was slipping through her fingers one breath at a time. "You should not be here," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, though it did not shake, and she held his gaze as she spoke, refusing to look away even when every instinct told her to retreat. For a moment, he did not answer, and the silence between them stretched again, not empty, but full, dense with something unspoken that neither of them seemed in a hurry to break. Then, slowly, he tilted his head just slightly, studying her in a way that made her feel seen in a way she had spent her entire life avoiding. "And yet," he said, his voice low and even, carrying none of the strain of the cold night around them, "this is exactly where I am meant to be." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but absolute, and Elara felt that same unsettling shift ripple through her again, stronger this time, as if something within her recognized the truth in them before she could deny it. She took a small step back without realizing she had done it, the movement instinctive, a need for space, for distance, for anything that might steady. The sudden awareness building beneath her skin. "You found the wrong person," she said, more firmly now, though her heart continued to beat faster, not with fear, but with something far more complicated, something she could not name and did not trust. His gaze did not waver. If anything, it softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in understanding, as if he had expected that answer and accepted it long before she spoke it. "No," he replied, just as calmly as before. "I did not." And for the first time since she had opened the door, Elara realized something that made the world feel just a little less steady beneath her feet. He was not here to search. He was not here to question. He was here because he already knew. Elara did not step any farther back, even though every instinct urged her to create distance, to close the door, to rebuild the fragile boundary she had just broken, because something in his presence made retreat feel meaningless, as if space itself no longer offered the protection it once had, and that realization unsettled her more than the cold air curling around her ankles or the quiet storm waiting just beyond him. The door remained half open between them, a narrow divide that felt thinner with every passing second, and she became acutely aware of how easily he could cross it, how easily he could step forward and claim the space she had fought so hard to make her own, yet he did not move, and that stillness, that restraint, carried more weight than any action could have. Her fingers tightened against the edge of the door, grounding herself in the rough grain of the wood, focusing on something real, something she could control, even as her thoughts began to shift in ways she did not like. He said he knew, not guessed, not suspected, knew. The certainty in his voice lingered, pressing against her composure, testing the edges of the calm she had built piece by piece in the weeks since she ran. "You should not be able to find me," she said, more to herself than to him, though the words carried across the narrow space all the same, her voice quieter now, edged with something closer to confusion than defiance. She had done everything right. Covered her tracks, stayed off known routes, avoided every scent marker and boundary line that might draw attention. She had erased herself from the map of the world. And yet he stood here, as if none of that mattered, as if it had never been enough. His gaze did not leave her face, steady and unreadable, and for a moment she wondered if he would answer, if he would explain how he had undone everything she had worked for with such quiet ease. But when he spoke, it was not explanation she received. "You were not meant to disappear," he said simply, the words delivered without force, without judgment, but with a certainty that settled heavily between them. Alara's breath caught, her chest tightening at the implication beneath his words, because Mint implied design, purpose, something larger than choice, and she had spent her entire life resisting exactly that. "I decide where I am meant to be," she replied quickly, the sharpness returning to her tone, a reflexive defense against the quiet pull of his certainty, against the part of her that wanted to listen instead of resist. Her grip on the door shifted again, her knuckles brushing the cold metal of the handle as she held her ground, refusing to let his presence dictate the space around her, even as it seemed to do so without effort. For a brief moment, something changed in his expression, not enough to soften him, not enough to make him seem less controlled, but enough to suggest that her words had reached him, that he recognized the strength behind them, the refusal to bend. "You decide many things," he said after a pause, his voice still calm, still even, but carrying a note of something deeper now, something that felt almost patient. "But not everything." The words lingered longer than they should have, settling into the quiet space of the cabin, into the rhythm of her breathing, into the steady beat of her heart, and Alara felt that same subtle shift again, the one she could not explain, the one that made her instincts react in ways that did not align with logic or reason. She did not like it. She did not trust it. And yet it was there, undeniable. She drew in a slow breath, forcing herself to steady, to reclaim control of her thoughts before they slipped too far into something she did not understand. "Then say what you came here to say," she said, lifting her chin slightly, meeting his gaze with renewed focus, with determination sharpened by the knowledge that she could not allow this moment to unfold on his terms alone. "And leave." It was a simple demand, clear and direct, the last thread of authority she could weave into a situation that was rapidly slipping beyond her control. For a moment, he did not respond, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if he were choosing his next words with care rather than necessity. Then, slowly, he took a single step forward, not into the cabin, not past the threshold, just enough to close the distance between them by a fraction, enough that the air shifted, enough that Alara felt it, a subtle change that made her breath catch again despite herself. "I came," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers, "because you have been running from something that will not stop looking for you." The words settled into her chest with a weight she could not ignore, not because of what they said, but because of how they felt, as if they reached beyond sound and into something deeper, something that had been waiting, whether she acknowledged it or not. And for the first time since she opened the door, Alara realized that whatever stood in front of her was not the beginning of the danger she had been avoiding. It was the moment she could no longer outrun it. The words settled into her like a quiet weight, not heavy enough to crush, but impossible to ignore, and Alara felt her breath slow without her permission, her body reacting in ways that did not align with the sharp edge of her thoughts, because she had spent weeks telling herself that running was enough, that distance was safety, that if she could just stay hidden long enough the world would forget her. But something in his voice made that belief feel thinner than it ever had before. She did not look away from him, even as the cold air drifted further into the cabin, brushing against her skin, even as the lantern flickered behind her, casting uncertain light across the floor between them, because if she looked away now, she knew she might not look back, and something about that felt like losing ground she could not afford to lose. "Nothing has been looking for me," she said, her tone steady again, controlled, though quieter than before, as if speaking too loudly might make his words more real than she wanted them to be. It was easier to deny it, easier to hold on to the version of truth she had built for herself. But even as she said it, a memory surfaced uninvited, A flicker of something she had pushed aside days ago. Then again the day before that. Small things she had dismissed as imagination, as nerves, as the lingering echo of fear. Tracks that did not belong to her. A branch that had not been broken the night before. The faint sense of being watched that she had forced herself to ignore. Her fingers tightened against the edge of the door, her pulse shifting, not racing, but sharpening, aligning with a different kind of awareness now, one that made her surroundings feel suddenly less certain. He watched her carefully, not with suspicion, not with pressure, but with a quiet attentiveness that suggested he saw the shift in her before she even acknowledged it herself, and that realization unsettled her more than anything he had said. "You felt it," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, calm and unhurried, as if he were simply placing a piece of something larger into position. Alara exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and for a moment she did not answer, because answering meant admitting that something had changed, that her certainty was no longer whole, and she was not ready to give that up so easily. "The forest is not empty," she replied instead, choosing her words carefully, grounding them in logic, in something she could still control. "There are always sounds, always movement." It was a reasonable explanation. It should have been enough. But even as she said it, the memory of that silence returned, the unnatural stillness that had settled over the cabin just before he knocked, the way the wind itself had seemed to pause, as if something had stepped into the space and claimed it without effort. His gaze softened again, not with sympathy, not with pity, but with understanding, as if he recognized the way she was holding on to that explanation, the way she was trying to keep the world within the boundaries she could manage. "This is not about the forest," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice now, something that carried a subtle shift in tone, not stronger, not louder, but deeper, as if the words came from a place beyond simple observation. Alara's chest tightened again, that same subtle pull brushing against her awareness, and she forced herself to remain still, to resist the urge to step back further, to close the door, to end this conversation before it reached something she could not undo. "Then what is it about?" she asked, her voice low, controlled, though the question carried more weight than she intended, because part of her already knew that the answer would not be simple, would not be something she could dismiss or reshape into something safer. For a moment, he did not respond, and in that silence, Alara became aware of something else, something she had not noticed before, not fully. The cold no longer felt as sharp near him. The air between them felt steadier, as if his presence alone shifted the space around him in ways she did not understand. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but once she noticed it, she could not ignore it. Then he spoke again, and this time, there was no distance left in his words, no space for misinterpretation. "It is about you," he said simply. The answer was direct, unhidden, and it landed with a clarity that left no room for avoidance, no room for the careful distance she had been trying to maintain. Alara's breath caught, just for a second, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, because something about the way he said it felt final, as if this moment had been building long before she ever stepped into this cabin, long before she ever chose to run. Her grip on the door loosened slightly, not in surrender, but in awareness, as if she had reached the edge of something she could not step back from. And for the first time since she opened the door, she realized that whatever had found her here had not followed her path through the forest. It had been waiting for her to arrive. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt full, as if something unseen had settled into place the moment he spoke, something that had been waiting patiently beneath every step she had taken since she ran, and Alara felt it in the way her chest tightened, not painfully, but with a strange, steady pressure that made it harder to hold on to the version of reality she had built for herself. She should have closed the door. The thought came late, quieter than it should have been, as if even her instincts were no longer certain which direction to pull her in, and that unsettled her more than anything else he had said or done. The cold air continued to drift between them, yet it no longer felt like a barrier, no longer felt like something that separated her from him, and she became acutely aware of the space she occupied, the narrow threshold where inside and outside blurred into something uncertain. "You do not know me," she said, her voice steady again, though softer now, less sharp, as if the edges of her resistance were beginning to wear down under the quiet persistence of his presence. It was not a surrender. Not yet. But it was no longer the same defiance she had held on to before. His gaze remained on her, unwavering, and there was something in it now that made her pulse shift again, not faster, not slower, but different, as if her body was trying to understand something her mind could not yet reach. "I know enough," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than any detailed explanation could have, because it left no space for argument, no space for her to dismantle it piece by piece the way she might have done with anything else. Enough. The word lingered, pressing against her thoughts, forcing her to consider what that meant, what he could possibly know that would bring him here, that would lead him directly to a place she had chosen because no one else would. Her fingers loosened slightly from the edge of the door, the tension in her grip easing without her permission, and she found herself studying him more carefully now, not just as a threat, not just as an intruder, but as something she needed to understand if she had any hope of regaining control of the situation. He did not look like the hunters she had avoided, did not carry the restless energy of those who chased and claimed and took without question. There was no urgency in him, no impatience. He stood as if time itself moved differently around him, as if waiting did not cost him anything at all. That alone made him more dangerous than anything she had encountered before. "Then say it," she said quietly, lifting her chin just slightly, her voice no longer edged with sharp resistance, but with something steadier, something closer to resolve. "Say what you think you know." The words were deliberate, an invitation and a challenge at the same time, the only way she could push back against the quiet certainty he carried so easily. For a moment, he did not answer, and in that pause, Alara felt the air shift again, subtle but undeniable, as if the world itself held its breath between them, waiting for something neither of them had yet spoken aloud. Her heart beat once, then again, steady and strong, but no longer entirely under her control, because there was something building beneath the surface now, something she could not ignore no matter how much she wanted to. When he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, did not press, but it carried something deeper than before, something that reached past her defenses without force. "You are not invisible," he said, and the words landed with quiet precision, cutting through the illusion she had built without effort, without resistance, as if they had always been true and she was only now being forced to hear them. Alara's breath caught, just for a second, her body reacting before she could stop it, because that was the one thing she had needed to believe more than anything else, the one thing that had made every step she took into the forest feel like survival instead of surrender. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant free. Invisible meant she could exist without being claimed, without being chosen, without being forced into a place she did not want. And now, standing in the doorway of the one place she thought no one could find her, she felt that belief begin to fracture. "You are wrong," she said quickly, though the words lacked the same certainty they once held, and she knew it the moment they left her mouth. He did not argue. He did not need to. Instead, he took another small step forward, still not crossing the threshold, still respecting the fragile boundary between them, but close enough now that she could feel the shift in the air more clearly, the subtle steadiness that seemed to follow him wherever he stood. "If that were true," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers, "I would not be here." The logic was simple, unavoidable, and for the first time since she opened the door, Alara did not have an answer ready, did not have a way to push back or turn away or reshape the moment into something she could control. She stood there, caught between what she had believed and what stood in front of her, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she realized something that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He had not broken her hiding place. He had revealed that it had never truly existed at all. The words did not echo, yet they stayed, settling into the quiet corners of the cabin and into the space between her thoughts, refusing to fade the way ordinary conversation should. And Alara felt something inside her shift again, slower this time, deeper, like a truth surfacing that had always been there, but had never been allowed to rise fully into view. Invisible. She had clung to that idea because it was simple, because it gave her control, because it meant she could exist without consequence. But standing here now, with the door open and the cold pressing in and him standing, just beyond the threshold, as if he had always known exactly where she would be. That belief no longer felt solid. It felt fragile. It felt incomplete. Her hand slipped slightly on the edge of the door, her grip no longer as firm as it had been, and she became aware of how long she had been standing there, caught in this moment that refused to move forward or backward, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate. Something neither of them had named yet. She should say something. She should push him away, close the door, reclaim the silence that had protected her. But the words did not come, not the ones she had relied on before, not the sharp refusals or the steady denials. Instead, she found herself asking a different question, one that rose before she could stop it. "Then what am I?" she said quietly, her voice softer now, not weak, but searching, carrying a note she had not allowed herself in a long time. The question hung between them, simple on the surface but heavier beneath, because it was not just about how he saw her. It was about everything she had tried to define for herself since the moment she ran. For a brief second, something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, not surprise, not uncertainty, but something closer to recognition, as if this was the question he had been waiting for her to ask. He did not answer immediately, and in that pause, Alara felt the space between them change again, not closing, not tightening, but deepening, like a quiet current beneath still water. Her heartbeat slowed, not because she felt safe, but because something in his presence steadied it without asking, without forcing, and that unsettled her in a way she could not explain. She did not trust anything that came without effort. She had learned too well that ease often came with a cost. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that same quiet certainty, but there was something else in it now, something that felt less like observation and more like truth. "You are the one who walked away," he said, each word deliberate, each one placed with care, not as a judgment, but as a fact. Alara blinked, the answer not what she expected, not what she had prepared herself to hear, and for a moment she did not know how to respond, because it was both simple and complicated at the same time. "That does not make me anything," she replied after a second, though her voice lacked the same firmness as before, because a part of her knew that was not entirely true. Walking away had changed everything. It had defined her in ways she had not fully acknowledged. He watched her for a moment longer, his gaze steady, and then he took another small step forward, close enough now that the space between them felt thinner than ever, close enough that she could see the subtle details she had missed before, the way his presence did not disrupt the world around him, but seemed to anchor it instead. "It makes you different," he said quietly, and the words settled into her with more weight than she expected, because different was not weak, not broken, not unwanted. It was something else entirely, something she had not allowed herself to consider. Alara exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and for the first time since this began, she did not immediately push back against his words, did not try to reshape them into something she could dismiss. Instead, she let them sit there, let them exist without resistance. And in doing so, she felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a surface that had been held together for too long. The door remained open between them, the barrier she had relied on now little more than a line she had not yet crossed, and she realized that closing it would not restore what she had lost, would not return her to the quiet certainty she had lived in before tonight. Because that certainty had already changed. It had already begun to unravel the moment he spoke her name. "You still have not told me why you are here," she said finally, her voice steadier now, not defensive, not searching, but grounded in something new, something that felt less like resistance and more like clarity. It was a question she needed answered, not to push him away, but to understand what stood in front of her, what had found her when she believed she could not be found. He did not hesitate this time. "Because you are not the only one who knows what it means to walk away," he said, and the words carried a quiet weight that made the air between them feel heavier, more real, as if something deeper had just been revealed without explanation. Alara's breath caught again, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever this was, whatever had brought him here, it was not as simple as she had wanted it to be. And for the first time, she understood that this moment was not just about being found. It was about something that had been waiting for her to stop running long enough to see it. His words did not rush past her, They lingered, slow and deliberate, as if they carried more meaning than their simplicity suggested, and Alara felt that meaning settled somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere closer to instinct, to that quiet place she had spent weeks trying to silence. Not the only one who walked away. The idea shifted something inside her, subtle but undeniable, because until now she had believed her choice was singular, an act of defiance that separated her from the rest of the world. But standing here, facing someone who spoke with the same quiet certainty she had once tried to hold on to, that belief no longer felt complete. Her eyes remained fixed on him, studying him more carefully now, not just as a stranger, not just as a threat, but as something she needed to understand if she was going to make sense of what was happening. There was no visible strain in his posture, no tension in the way he held himself against the cold, and yet there was something in him that did not belong to the stillness of the forest or the isolation of this place. It was not just presence. It was weight. Not heavy, not oppressive, but undeniable, like standing near something vast and steady that did not need to prove its strength. "You walked away from what?" she asked quietly, the question forming before she could stop it, because if he expected her to listen, then he would have to give her something real in return, something more than quiet statements and half-truths that pressed against her without explanation. The wind stirred faintly outside, brushing against the trees, but it no longer felt like the dominant force in the night. That had changed. He did not answer immediately, and for a moment Alara wondered if he would avoid the question the same way he had avoided others, offering something just enough to keep her engaged without revealing anything she could hold on to. But when he spoke, there was no avoidance in it. "Expectation," he said simply, and the word landed with more force than anything else he had said, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. Too familiar. Alara's breath caught slightly, her fingers tightening once more against the edge of the door, because expectation was not just a word, it was something she understood too well, something that had shaped every decision she had been forced to make before she chose to run. "That is not something you can leave behind," she replied, her voice steadier now, grounded in the truth she had learned the hard way, because expectation followed, it pressed, it waited, it did not simply disappear because you chose to walk away from it. He watched her closely as she spoke, and there was something in his gaze now that suggested agreement rather than contradiction, as if he recognized the truth in her words and did not intend to deny it. "No," he said after a moment, his voice as calm as before, "it is not." The confirmation settled into the space between them, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching again, but it felt different now, less uncertain, more grounded, as if something had shifted into alignment without either of them forcing it. Alara exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and she felt the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly, not because she trusted him, not because she felt safe, but because the conversation had moved into something real, something she could engage with instead of resist blindly. "Then why are you here?" she asked again, more directly this time, her voice carrying a quiet insistence, because understanding this mattered now in a way it had not before, because whatever this was, it was no longer just about him finding her, it was about why he had come at all. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then, slowly, something shifted in his expression, not enough to soften him, but enough to suggest that whatever he was about to say carried more weight than what had come before. "Because walking away does not change what you are," he said, his voice low, steady, each word placed with deliberate clarity. The sentence settled heavily into the space between them, and Alara felt it immediately, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as something closer to truth, something that pressed against the fragile structure she had built around herself since she ran. Her breath caught again, her pulse shifting, not racing, but sharpening, because that was the one thing she had tried to redefine more than anything else, the one thing she had believed she could reshape simply by leaving everything behind. "And what is that?" she asked quietly, though the question felt heavier now, more dangerous, because she was no longer certain she wanted to hear the answer. For a moment, he did not speak, and in that silence, Alara became aware of the space between them in a new way, not as distance, not as separation, but as something charged with meaning she had not yet understood. Then he took a breath, slow and controlled, and when he spoke again, His voice carried a quiet finality that left no room for doubt. "Someone who was never meant to be claimed," he said. The words did not echo, but they settled deep, reaching into something she had not allowed herself to name, something she had felt but never understood. And for the first time since this began, Elara did not push back, did not deny, did not reach for the safety of resistance. Because a part of her, buried beneath fear and instinct and survival, recognized the truth in it before she could stop herself. The words did not feel like a declaration. They felt like something uncovered, something that had always existed beneath everything she had been told, beneath every rule she had been expected to follow. And Elara felt the truth of it settle into her in a way that made it impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss as just another attempt to draw her back into a world she had left behind. Someone who was never meant to be claimed. The idea should have felt impossible. It should have sounded like something fragile, something unrealistic, something she could break apart with logic and experience. But it did not. Instead, it fit too well, sliding into place against every moment she had never understood, every time something had felt wrong in ways she could not explain. Her breath slowed, her chest rising and falling in a steadier rhythm now, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it had changed shape, shifting from resistance into something quieter, something that demanded to be understood rather than rejected. "That is not how it works," she said after a moment, though her voice lacked the force it once carried. Because even as she spoke, she could hear the uncertainty beneath it, the crack forming in the certainty she had relied on for so long. Everyone is meant to be chosen. It was what she had been taught, what everyone believed, what defined the structure of the world she had come from. He did not interrupt her, did not dismiss her words. But there was something in his expression now that suggested he had heard this before, not just from others, but from himself, as if the idea of what was meant to be had never been as simple as it appeared. "That is what you were told," he replied, his voice calm, steady, carrying no judgment, only clarity. "It is not the same as truth." The distinction settled heavily between them, and Elara felt it press against her thoughts, forcing her to confront the difference in a way she had avoided before. Told, not truth. The two words separated everything she had built her understanding on, leaving space for something else to exist, something she had never considered because she had never been given the choice to consider it. Her fingers loosened further from the door, her grip no longer anchored in tension, and she found herself stepping back without realizing it, creating space not out of fear, but out of the need to breathe, to think, to process what he was saying without the weight of proximity pressing so closely against her awareness. The cabin felt different now, not smaller, not larger, but altered, as if the presence of this conversation had shifted the way the space existed around her. The familiar walls, the worn table, the quiet corner where she had slept night after night, all of it felt slightly removed, as if she were seeing it from a distance she had not chosen. "If that were true," she said slowly, her voice quieter, more measured, "then why does everything work the way it does?" It was not a challenge. It was a question, one rooted in the reality she had lived, in the patterns she had seen repeated over and over again, in the certainty that had shaped every life she had known. Because even if she felt something shifting now, even if his words carried a truth she could not ignore, the world beyond this cabin still existed, still followed the same rules she had run from. He stepped forward again then, this time crossing the threshold just enough to stand within the doorway, not fully inside, not fully outside, but in that same uncertain space she had occupied moments before, and Elara felt the shift immediately, not in fear, not in alarm, but in awareness, as if something had aligned in a way that had not been possible before. "Because most do not question it," he said quietly, his gaze steady on hers, his presence grounding in a way she did not understand but could not deny. "And those who do are taught to believe they are wrong." The words landed with quiet force, and Elara felt them echo through her thoughts, connecting to every moment she had doubted herself, every time she had felt out of place, every time she had been told to accept what she was given without question. Her breath caught, not sharply, but deeply, as if something inside her had just shifted into alignment, something she had been resisting without even realizing it. "And you," she said softly, her voice barely above the steady rhythm of her breathing now, You are one of those who questioned it. It was not a question. It was recognition. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then, slowly, he nodded, the movement subtle but unmistakable. I am, he said. The confirmation settled into her, steady and certain, and for the first time since he arrived, Alara felt the shape of something new begin to form, not fear, not resistance, but something far more dangerous in its own way. Understanding. Because if he was right, if what he was saying held truth beyond this moment, then everything she had run from was not just something to escape. It was something she had never been meant to belong to in the first place. And that realization changed everything. Understanding did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like light, filtering through something that had been closed for too long. And Alara felt it in the way her breathing steadied, in the way her thoughts no longer raced to defend or deny, but instead began to shift, to rearrange themselves around something new, something she had not allowed herself to consider before this moment. The cabin no longer felt like a place she was hiding in. It felt like a place she had paused in, as if the act of running had brought her here not to disappear, but to stop long enough for something else to catch up. Her gaze remained fixed on him, but there was less resistance in it now, less of that sharp edge she had used to protect herself, and more focus, more intention, as if she were finally seeing him for what he was rather than what she feared he might be. If you knew this, she said quietly, her voice steady but softer now, then why did no one else? The question carried more than curiosity. It carried the weight of everything she had lived through, every moment she had been told what she was supposed to be, every time she had felt something did not fit and had been told to ignore it. Because if this truth existed, if it had always existed, then why had it been hidden so completely? He did not answer immediately, and the pause felt different now, not uncertain, not evasive, but thoughtful, as if he were choosing how much to reveal, not to protect himself, but to ensure she understood. Because it is easier to follow what is given than to question it, he said finally, his voice low, even, the words carrying a quiet weight that settled easily into the space between them. And those who question it are rarely heard. Alara absorbed that, her eyes lowering just slightly as she considered it, because she knew that truth in ways she had never been able to explain, had felt it in the way her doubts had been dismissed, in the way her instincts had been treated as flaws instead of something worth listening to. Her fingers brushed lightly against the wood of the door, not gripping it anymore, just touching it, as if she needed something solid to anchor her as everything else shifted. And you were heard, she said, though it came out more as a statement than a question, because he stood here now, certain in a way she had never seen before, and that certainty had not come from being ignored. His gaze held hers, steady and clear, and for a moment there was something in it that changed, not softer, not weaker, but more open, as if he was allowing her to see something he did not show to others. Not at first, he said, and there was a quiet honesty in it that made her chest tighten slightly, because it meant his path had not been simple, had not been easy, had required something more than just knowing. But eventually, I stopped waiting to be. The words carried a different kind of weight, one that settled deeper, because they spoke of choice, of action, of stepping beyond what was expected instead of simply resisting it. Alara felt that settle into her, connecting to something she had done without fully understanding it, something she had chosen the moment she turned away from the life she had been told to accept. You walked away, she said softly, echoing his earlier words, but now they held a different meaning, one shaped by everything he had revealed. He gave a slight nod, the movement subtle but certain, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, but it no longer felt heavy, no longer felt uncertain. It felt balanced, as if something had aligned without either of them forcing it into place. The cold air still lingered at the doorway, but it no longer felt sharp against her skin, no longer felt like something she needed to shield herself from, and she realized that she had taken another small step back without noticing, creating space not out of fear, but out of something else, something that allowed him to stand there without overwhelming her, without taking more than she was willing to give. Then why me? She asked finally, her voice quiet but clear, because this was the question that mattered now, the one that would define everything that came next. If he had walked away, if he understood what it meant to question everything, then why had he come here? To her. to someone who had only just begun to understand any of it. His gaze did not waver, did not shift. And for a moment it felt as though the world had narrowed again, not in tension, but in focus, as if everything outside this moment had faded just enough to make what he said next impossible to ignore. "Because you did not just walk away," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty. But now there was something more in it, something that felt almost deliberate. "You refused to be defined by what you were told." The words settled into her, deeper than anything before them, because they spoke to something she had not named, something she had done without understanding why, something that had driven her forward even when fear had told her to stop. Her breath caught, not sharply, but steadily, as if something inside her had just been recognized, not by herself, but by someone else who understood it completely. And in that moment, Alara realized that this was not just about being found or being understood. It was about being seen in a way she had never experienced before, and that realization was both grounding and unsettling at the same time, because it meant she could no longer pretend she did not exist the way she had always feared she might. The words did not fade after he spoke them. They remained, steady and unyielding, settling into the quiet space between them and into the deeper places within her where doubt and instinct had always been at odds. And Alara felt something inside her finally begin to align, not perfectly, not completely, but enough that the tension she had carried for so long no longer felt like something she needed to hold together at all costs. She had spent her life trying to fit into something that had never truly made sense, trying to accept a role that felt wrong in ways she could not explain, and when she could not, she had run, believing that distance alone would solve what she did not understand. But now, standing here with the door open and the cold drifting in and his presence steady in a way that made everything else feel less certain, she realized that running had not been the solution. It had been the beginning. Her fingers slipped fully away from the door, her hand falling loosely at her side, no longer clinging to the barrier as if it could protect her from something that was no longer outside of her, but within the choices she had yet to make. The cabin behind her felt quieter now, not empty, but still, as if it had served its purpose and no longer needed to hold her in the same way it once had. "And what does that change?" she asked softly, her voice no longer edged with resistance, no longer shaped by the need to defend what she had believed, but by something steadier, something more grounded in the understanding that was slowly taking shape. Because if everything he said was true, if she had never been meant to be what she had been told, then what came next mattered more than anything that had come before. He watched her carefully, and there was something in his gaze now that had not been there when he first arrived, something that reflected the shift in her rather than challenged it, as if he had been waiting for this moment, not to force it, but to see if she would reach it on her own. "It changes what you choose to do now," he said quietly, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it placed the decision back where it had always belonged, not in the expectations of others, not in the structure of the world she had left behind, but in her. Alara drew in a slow breath, the cold air filling her lungs, grounding her in the present, in the moment that stood in front of her without offering the comfort of certainty. Choice. It was something she had fought for without fully understanding it, something she had claimed the moment she turned away from everything she had known, and now it stood before her again, not as an escape, but as a path forward she had yet to define. Her gaze shifted slightly, not away from him, but beyond him, to the forest stretching out behind, to the endless line of trees and snow and shadow that had once felt like safety simply because it was unknown. Now it felt different, not threatening, not protective, just open. "You said something was looking for me," she said after a moment, her voice calm, deliberate, as if she were placing each word with care. Was that a warning? Or a reason? The question settled between them, carrying more than its surface meaning, because it was no longer about fear, no longer about something chasing her through the dark. It was about understanding what had drawn him here, what had brought this moment into existence. He did not hesitate this time. "Neither," he said, and the answer was as steady as everything else he had given her. But there was something in it now, something that carried a quiet finality. It was a truth you were not ready to see. Alara absorbed that, letting it settle without resisting it, without trying to reshape it into something easier to accept, because she was beginning to understand that ease had never been the point. The truth had always been there, beneath everything she had been told, beneath everything she had tried to believe, waiting for her to reach a place where she could see it clearly. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, not in surrender, but in release, as if she had been holding something far heavier than she realized, and was only now letting it go. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain, no longer filled with tension or unanswered questions. It felt complete, as if something had reached its natural conclusion without needing to be forced. Alara looked back at him then, fully, without hesitation, without the instinct to retreat or defend, and in that moment, she saw him differently, not as someone who had found her, not as someone who had disrupted her isolation, but as someone who had arrived at the exact moment she could no longer remain where she was. "Then you did not come to take me back," she said quietly, her voice steady, certain now in a way it had not been before. It was not a question. It was recognition. He held her gaze, and for the first time since he had spoken her name, there was no distance in it, no separation between what he knew and what she was beginning to understand. "No," he said, and the word carried everything she needed to hear, because it meant this was not about returning to something she had left behind. It was about stepping into something she had never been allowed to see, and standing there in the doorway of a place she had once believed was her only refuge. Alara realized that she was no longer choosing between staying hidden and being found. She was choosing whether to move forward at all. The moment did not demand urgency. It did not press her forward or pull her back, and that was what made it real, because for the first time since she had stepped into this cabin, since she had turned her back on everything she had known, nothing was forcing her to choose except herself. The wind returned softly beyond him, brushing through the trees in a low, steady rhythm, no longer restless, no longer searching, just present, and Alara felt it in the quiet shift of the air around her, in the way the cold no longer felt like something to endure, but something that simply existed. She stood there for a long second, her gaze steady on him, her breathing even, her thoughts no longer racing but settling, aligning into something clearer than they had ever been before. She had run to survive. That much was true, but she had stayed hidden because she did not know what came next. And now she did. Not in detail, not in certainty, but in direction. That was enough. Her hand lifted slightly, not to grasp the door, not to hold on to it, but to let it rest there for a moment, her fingers brushing the worn wood as if acknowledging what this place had been to her, what it had given her when she needed it most. Shelter, silence, time. It had not been a prison. It had been a pause, and pauses were not meant to last forever. Slowly, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them by a fraction, not crossing into his space, not surrendering anything, but no longer retreating either, and the shift was small but undeniable, a choice made without words. His gaze followed her movement, not surprised, not demanding, simply present, as if he had always known she would reach this moment on her own. "If I leave," she said quietly, her voice steady, grounded in something deeper than the uncertainty she had carried before, "I do not go back." The statement settled between them, clear and absolute, because there was no version of this where she returned to what she had escaped, no path that led her back into. Something she now understood had never truly been hers. He did not hesitate. "You do not," he replied, his voice carrying the same calm certainty it always had, but now it felt different, not like something placed against her resistance, but something that aligned with her own decision. Alara exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and she felt the last of that tension she had carried finally ease, not disappear, but transform into something else, something she could move with instead of against. Her gaze shifted briefly past him again, to the forest stretching wide and open, no longer just a place to hide, but something else entirely, something that felt like possibility rather than escape. She had spent weeks believing she was alone here, that she had carved out a place untouched by the world, but now she understood that being alone had never been the point. Being unseen had never been the goal. It had only been the beginning of understanding who she was without everything she had been told to be. And now that she understood, even if only in part, she could not stay the same. Her fingers slipped away from the door completely, her hand lowering to her side, no longer needing the support, no longer holding onto the last piece of what this place represented. The cabin stood behind her, quiet and still, no longer a barrier between her and the world, but a marker of where she had been. She looked at him again, fully, without hesitation, and for the first time there was no question in her expression, no doubt, no need to test or challenge what stood in front of her. Only awareness. Only choice. Then I go forward, she said, her voice calm, certain, carrying the quiet weight of something decided rather than debated. The words did not need emphasis. They did not need explanation. They simply were. He watched her for a moment longer, and then, slowly, he stepped back, creating space rather than closing it, opening the path instead of narrowing it. And the gesture was simple but unmistakable, an acknowledgement that this had never been about taking, never been about claiming, only about reaching the moment where she could choose without fear shaping the outcome. Alara did not hesitate this